This podcast is created for farmers and powered by Pioneer Agronomy to bring you agronomic insights and proven solutions to fuel forward-thinking farming.
Back to another edition of the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy Podcast. I am Carl Joern, pleased to be joined as always by my colleagues and co-hosts, Brian Schrader and Ben Jacob, fellow agronomists representing Northeast Indiana and West Central and the southern part of the state. How are you, fellas?
Very good, Carl. Glad to be here this morning.
Doing well, Carl. How are you?
I'm doing just fine, thank you. News of the day, news of the weekend was we had a pretty good storm system that blew through the great state of Indiana here. Would have been last Friday afternoon, and we thought that would be what on tap for folks today. So maybe we'll just do a quick round the horn in terms of assessment. We'll start up in the northeast quadrant of the state. Brian, if you have any thoughts on what you and your contingent has seen out of what came through here just a handful of days ago.
Yeah, well, I would say for the eastern part of the state, Carl, it's probably more of the same in terms of just the scattered nature of the rainfall totals. You can go just a couple miles and have drastically different amounts. The storm that came through on Friday was no different. We had some areas that got super heavy precipitation. I mean, 3-4 inches in my local geography, and had other areas that the ground barely got wet. We didn't have some of the wind and storm damage that I know Ben will talk about, and even for yourself, it appears to have lost a decent amount of intensity as it moved across the state. So we really had more about rainfall, and unfortunately, a lot of those areas that have continued to be wet remained wet. They were the areas that caught the heaviest part of the rain during those storms as they rolled through. So probably more of the same, I would say, is what it is. But again, I don't think we had quite the damage. It'll be more about those heavy pockets or heavy rain pockets, and then trying to evaluate replant more so than actual storm damage is what we saw here on the east side of the state for the most part.
Okay, good deal. Thank you, Brian. And then in terms of state of affairs, planting progress, where do y'all stand in that department with respect to corn and beans?
We're in pretty good shape from canvas of the eastern agronomist here, at least north of I-70 in Indiana. I'd say we're probably all pretty close to that 90+% on corn, probably a little bit more than that on soybeans. My personal territory may be lagging on soybeans a bit, but we tend to not be quite the 50-50. We tend to have more of a 2/3, 1/3 type of rotation oftentimes, especially given where commodity prices are this year. But I would say for the most part in the northeast corner of the state, we're approaching the 95% on corn, probably 95, maybe 97 on soybeans. So again, a few of those pockets I mentioned that are going to need to finish up. Hopefully, I know we had a good run here over this weekend before we are looking at some potential rain coming in on the 20th of the month as we record this. So I think we've made pretty good progress. A little bit of replant starting to go in now as guys have finished up, but we've made really good progress over the last handful of days.
Very good. Thank you, Brian. Ben, we'll head south from there. What's the status across your neck of the woods?
Yeah, so maybe we'll start backwards to what Brian did and about planting progress. We actually are coming off of a really big week. There are some areas where guys are getting pretty close to wrapping up. Unfortunately, they're not where I cover, but there are some areas in the southern half of the state that are getting pretty close. I think in generalities, I would say that everything south of, call it I-70, or everything south of Indy, we're probably about 60% planted. To guess just overall. So good progress from maybe 20% a week ago,
Right.
On the weather front, Friday, that system that came through, it brought some of the variability that Brian spoke to. At my house, I had 1/10 of an inch of rain. I could watch to the north of me a funnel cloud form and spin that never touched down, but you could definitely see it rotating. And to the south of me, I could see just darkness, which turned out that darkness was, maybe due south of me and west, dropping some baseball-sized hail, and then turned into a tornado that, well, it wasn't super wide. I think they finally classified it as an EF2. It did have a pretty long track. It was on the ground for a good ways. You know, a family in that area, and obviously know a lot of people down there, and there was pretty significant damage. But for the most part, at least the people that I know are all healthy, and so, we're fortunate to get that. But Saturday morning was the first time in my career that I've got phone calls to come scout tornado damage and corn and soybeans. So I can mark that off my list of things that I've done that I never wanted to do, but it'll be ongoing for a few days here. We can talk about that a little bit more. But from a rainfall standpoint, like I said, I had a tenth at my house. A little bit to the north of me was around an inch. It was really variable, but overall totals were much less than what was expected or what was forecasted for it. So, what'd you guys get into up there, Carl?
Yeah, Ben, that system brought a fair amount of dust movement, if you will. Soil was moving. According to the National Weather Service, this was for Northwest Indiana, West Central Indiana, the largest dust storm that we've witnessed since the Dust Bowl era of the 1930s. So, if you look at a drought monitor map, just like we've got good planting progress, button up against the fat lady singing, if you will, in my area of the state that follows where we've been dry and we've been able to continually get the crop in. But when you don't have that wetting front, in the upper crust of the soil, that means that it's subject to, wind erosion, movements of that nature. And so we had a pretty good dust cloud moving. Those winds were southerly, moving to the north, and so that brought an impressive amount of soil movement with it. So the folks north of central Illinois and central Indiana are thanking those folks to the south for their, freshly deposited topsoil, but it did come with some, crop damage locally. So Oxford, Indiana area, just west of the West Lafayette geography, their weather station showed a gust of 75 miles per hour. That's enough to get things moving. And as you can imagine, coarser textured soils are going to, they're going to have the potential for damage. So I learned a new term today it's called a haboob is the proper name of that meteorological anomaly where you have, aeolian deposited material. So windblown sediments typically happens right in the Sahara Desert. But that's not where we are in the breadbasket of America, but that's where we found ourselves on Friday. So, we can get a little bit more into, damage assessment. Ben can talk to tornado damage. I can talk to, particulate damage from soils, and we'll get you rounded out in terms of how to assess your fields. And this should come at just the perfect amount of time in terms of giving the crop a little bit of a chance to respond here. So, with that, Ben, maybe you want to speak a little bit more in detail of what you saw on Saturday and how you're advising folks as they're making decisions.
Yeah, so Carl, I think you nailed it to start with there, and the intro is it's hard to do, but we need to be patient, right? And I think, we're in a fortunate spot because of the misfortune we've had all spring with the delayed planting. One of the fields that I looked at on Saturday had on Friday afternoon had been a beautiful stand of V4-ish corn, and it was just gone, just completely gone from the road. You couldn't tell it had been planted, and we still had pretty significant wind on Saturday. So I've got some pictures that are interesting. That a tornado just went through, and there's dust clouds, like you're speaking to, carrying through. So back to the corn. Be patient. I know that it is tough to look at, but I'm going to say V4, V5, and younger corn. Even if it got clipped off right at the ground, the growing point is still below ground. So, sometime mid this week, by the time this episode comes out, you should see signs of life out there. And give it a few more days, and you'll likely be amazed at what's coming out of the ground. The caveat to that is that if you can get some kind of necrotic spots in the tissue that will make those plants want to buggy whip, where the leaves won't want to unfurl, right? So that'd be number one. But I think most of our corn was delayed enough in planting that it's going to come out of it just fine. Now, I am a little less certain on some of the hail damage stuff, just because of how much of an impact baseball sized hail can make. And so I don't have a great reference point on that to know, like, is this going to be damaged underneath the soil surface? Did it damage that growing point? Now, that wasn't as widespread. I don't think we have any fields that are completely taken off the map by hail, but we are going to have some fields with damage in them. So with that, I think, again, patience is key. We'll see what the regrowth looks like, and then we can do an overall stand assessment, which we've talked about quite a bit, Brian.
Ben, I would say one of the things too, you pointed this out with your tornado damage, the fact that the corn is gone completely, the chances of running into some of those necrotic spots are probably a little bit less. It's been my experience that when you have the wind damage or hail that just completely pulverizes everything above ground and there's no dead tissue kind of laying around that gets twisted up and starts to rot, you're probably, believe it or not, in a better spot. I would expect, at least from my experience, for you with your tornado damage to see better reemergence than what you potentially could with the hail damage, just because of the dead tissue that gets beat down and it just kind of lays there, and that necrotic stuff that you talk about. One of the things that oftentimes comes about in those situations is guys will ask about fungicide applications. Would that be helpful in those situations? I've never seen that be helpful at all, because it's really not a fungus. We're just talking about the junk that happens when you've got that dead tissue there. So I know that there may be some guys that are thinking that might be beneficial, but I just remind folks at that, until you got a good stand, it's probably not worth spending the money on the fungicide application.
Yeah, well, and that's a good call out. And in this instance, Brian, where things currently stand, there's no green tissue to
Right.
catch a fungicide anyway.
Sure.
So,
Yeah, you bet.
It's of limited utility from that aspect as well. Now, on the soybean front, that's a little bit different story. If your soybeans are out of the ground and everything's gone, once those cotyledons are out, if you get rid of the cotyledons, that plant's done. Okay, so if you had beans out of the ground and the tornado took them, that's a replant situation from day one, right? Some of the beans with hail damage, it's kind of a similar story, even though the growing point is above ground with the hail that we had, right? You're probably going to have some individual plants that are injured. Hopefully it's not entire fields, but again, we'll have to assess that. If you were in some of the areas that had some of the smaller hail, as we moved north, we had some maybe quarter-sized hail, not a ton of it, but in those fields, you can go out and start to assess plants really and see what's injured on them. If we have beans with a trifoliate out and a hailstone broke that trifoliate off, that bean's going to be fine. Right? It's going to branch from down below. There's additional growing points. It'll branch out and fill in, and we'll have no problems with it. And so I think from this particular system, the overall, the hail damage to crops is going to be pretty minimal, just because of the amount of ground coverage. Now, the hail damage to vehicles and houses and infrastructure, significant, but I think from the crop standpoint, it's going to be pretty minimal. Going into the weekend or going into Friday evening, rainfall totals were just as much of a concern as the wind. And as I mentioned, we really didn't get much. Even those areas that got an inch, that wasn't so significant that they won't come out of it. So, I mean, to sum all of it up, really, by the time this comes out on Wednesday, we'll have a good idea. We'll be able to see what's growing, but be patient. Things are going to look rough for a while. But I think overall, we're going to wind up with some bean fields that we need to replant. But outside of that, it's just going to look ugly for a week or two, and then we'll be off to the races again.
Very good. Few thoughts in terms of what you referred to, Ben, about that idea of the hail damage and it being tougher to reveal itself as readily. It's kind of like a bruise, right? You have the
Mhm.
impact injury, but you can't tell how big the bruise is going to be right away. You need to give it some time for the body to reflect how big of a, impact it was. No different with the plant. And, so if you're there within a couple days, you could see, some discoloring that's taking place. Then eventually you're going to get to your other senses picking up. You'll smell it, in the way that tissue is no longer viable. And to Brian's point, as you work your way north and you're getting into some more of the sandblasted territory, the tattering of leaves allows for more places for that world to kind of get twisted up and buggy whipped within itself. Ben, to your point previously, when I worked at the diagnostic center here for Purdue University a decade ago, what we would do is or I guess it's been more than a decade ago now, we take weed whackers and simulate a hail injury that way. And at corn that's this size, I mean, you could mow it right off to the ground and there's nothing to be afraid of there. It's not until, you're well into V5 that you see the growing points start to come above the soil surface. So really resilient plant that way. And for beans that were planted earlier, if you look elsewhere in the state, Ben had made mention of, well, you lose the cotyledons, you're SOL. Similar sentiments, but if you have larger canopies that are establishing, if you got, the first unifoliates or a couple true trifoliates here, you could actually find yourself in a place of, well, I have more green tissue to lose. So in the event it's not tornado damage and I still have some green material on that plant, those are all potential growing points to, reinitiate growth from the apical meristem. So fingers crossed that maybe you've got something to work with there and the plant could, branch out if you lose the main growing point, but that's all based on local conditions. So more to come there. And Brian, I liked your comment about fungicide because that's right. That's usually the next question. If I don't need to replant this field, if you're telling me it's alive, what can I do to make it thrive? And a lot of our fungal pathogens that we deal with in corn, they don't need a wound site to enter. And so the question now comes to, all right, that fungicide application, if it's not for disease prevention, if it's for ethylene suppression, are we using the right tool in the toolbox there if we're trying to make sure that the plant is thriving? And perhaps that's room for a biostimulant, to enter the space to help with fungicide resistance in our different microbial populations. So submitting that for consideration. If we're out in western Nebraska, when you're dealing with Gossa's wilt, then yep, we'd have the conversation about what this hail storm could have done or what this wind damage could have done. But we don't have a whole lot of Gosses in our area of the country, so that bacterial disease isn't something we're really going to worry about, and can't apply fungicide to manage for it. So, yeah, a couple thoughts in that regard. As we kind of look, this dropping towards the end of May, right? We're the back third of May when this airs. And Ben, you're at somewhere around 50-60% planted down in southern Indiana. Folks usually plant fuller season corn and they're usually further along at this point. How would you advise growers that may or may not be considering changing the maturity of their hybrid based on how much season is left ahead of them?
Yeah, so my typical answer, Carl, is talk to me after Memorial Day, and we'll see. We are skewed a little bit more fuller season than what we have been in recent years, just because of product performance and 115, 117 day maturities down here. So we do have a little bit more of that out. That has some folks a little bit nervous. We've had many conversations, and look, the plan is the plan for a reason. Right. We didn't have this particular product mix on a whim. We had it because that gives us the best chance of success. So I would start there. And look, I get it. If you don't have a dryer, don't have access to a dryer, that changes the calculus a little bit. But even if you look at 1742, which is about as full season as we're using right now, if you planted it on June 1st and look at average heat average heat accumulation, it's going to black layer before there's a frost. And we have been, if you think back on recent years, getting quite a bit of heat in October. So I really think that it would dry down just fine. You may be harvesting it later than what you wanted, but I mean by the end of October it'd be below 20%. If you look, at the average heat we're getting recently, and should reach black layer well before a frost. So I think that if it comes down to logistics, is there a little bit more risk? Yes, of course, but I think that the performance is there. And at this point, Brian mentioned commodities early. At this point, I would not shy away from bushels for logistical reasons. We have to have the bushels, right? With where we're at. So I would strongly encourage everybody to stay the course, at least for the rest of the month. And then when we get into June, we can talk and we can work through some of the math on individual products and where you're at. But again, the plan is the plan for a reason, and I personally see no reason to pivot from that, understanding, right, that there are challenges that come with late planting, and nobody wants to have to deal with a whole slug of wet corn. But we take all kinds. I've had several of the conversations like, I feel it's getting too late to do this. And then had a conversation last Friday. A guy told me, I put in a new dryer last year and didn't even turn it on. And so I'm not afraid to burn that gas this year. So, we're all over the board with that. But I know it's starting to feel late to guys, and we have more rain in the forecast. And if the next 10 days looked wide open and we could wrap up, I don't think we'd have any conversations. I think it's the rain that continues to be in the forecast that's causing the challenge for some folks. But we're still in a good spot, and I think that, again, for the rest of this month, that if we can get even that fuller season corn out, it's going to be fine, and that's where the performance is as well. So I would definitely stick with that. And also, you guys up north are wrapping up, so a little bit more pushback. If we do need to get extra product, I can come steal it from you guys. So, we may have to make that decision eventually, but not yet.
Ryan is our resident meteorologist, climate interested person here. I would submit, if you could tell me what the weather's going to be in August, September, October, I could tell you if you wanted to make a well-educated decision to change your hybrid maturity.
Completely agree. As Ben was talking, my thoughts went to our friends at the MRCC. They've got a great tool that you can use, that you can plug stuff in. My guess is when Ben was referencing his dates, he probably had that pulled up or has at least looked at it. But you can certainly look at that. The best thing that we can do is go on 20 or 30-year averages. The MRCC tool, the Midwest Regional Climate Center, that's what I'm talking about. We've had the state climatologist on and have referenced that. Purdue hosts that. But you put that in, you can spitball all this stuff, Carl, and you can look at what historically that August weather has been to try to make these kind of decisions. But you're absolutely right. And I'll be honest with you, at this moment, my confidence in forecasting has not been very good based on our results thus far in 2025. So I'm not going to venture out there. I will say the National Weather Service has probably done as well as anybody in terms of making those predictions and getting close. They don't really necessarily tell you where rain's coming, but they give you those averages. And so I just continue to look at the 6 to 14 day for everybody out there. That's what I do. And then run some of these examples like Ben's talking about, and we can put in GDUs for 1742 and look at that. And you can select certain years. You can select 5 years. You can select 10 years to look at exactly what you're talking about. But to your point, if we knew exactly what the weather conditions were going to be in August, to Ben's point, the plan might look a little bit different than what we started out with.
Right. We've had several folks in the last 2 years that have planted 1742 as the example, in the first week of June and get along just fine. And so with that, it's all based on the amount of heat we're going to accumulate throughout the season. And one thing to bear in mind is you take a look at that, that GDU calculator tool through the Midwest Regional Climate Centers. It's not accounting for the anomaly of the later corn is planted, the more it shortens up its physiological maturity in terms of the amount of heat required there. And that's, if we really want to get down to brass tacks for the analytically inclined, you're looking at about 7 GDUs for every day in delayed planting, starting on May 1st, up until your date of planting. So if you planted on, the 30th of May, 30 times 7 is 210. You take that off of 1742 is roughly 2,800 GDUs to maturity. There's your answer of what we would expect based off of, research in terms of corn physiology to be the case of when you're going to reach black layer. And then it comes down to what are our drying conditions in October? Do you have a wet October? Do you have a warm October, right? All of these things come into play for that decision. But I think we're all very well aligned here that we're chasing after yield potential right now. And since we do not have the crystal ball for what 2025's late summer, early fall is going to bring for weather, it's probably best to lean on historical averages. And based on our own Pioneer research data, we do not see an incentive in the central or, approaching the northern corn belt to make a maturity swap here, even in the latter part of May. So just wanted to put that on the record so that folks can feel good about their decisions. But if you are risk averse or so inclined and you'd like to make a change in, your plan, obviously work with your trusted advisor to get you in a plan that makes you feel comfortable. So we touched on corn there. Soybean, just briefly, I don't recall if we've talked through any soybean crusting or soybean replant decisions. Quick rapid fire here. Brian Schrader, what is the number that you need to see as you go out taking a soybean stand assessment for you to say, go thicken it up, go rip it up? What's it look like? And you can give me the right answer here.
Yeah. So in good soils, if I have 100,000, I feel pretty good about that. In some of my tougher, lighter colored, tighter clays, I really would prefer to see no less than about 125. Those are just kind of, hip shot kind of numbers for you real quick. There's a little bit more nuance in there, but that's kind of the rough number I guess I would give you at the moment.
Sure. Perfect. Thank you. And as folks will hear our thoughts here, it's definitely indicative of the geographies that we serve. So your results may vary. Ben Jacob, what do you got to see for,
Brian called out that the important part that on your thinner soils, your tougher soils, you're going to need more. But planting date is important. So when it comes to replant decisions, I'm looking at my planting windows right now, and we had a decent little window around April 28th. Okay, so on May 21st, I would take 80,000 beans planted April 28th rather than replant those or go back into them and tear anything out. But I also have a little bit longer growing season than what Brian's going to, and I get a little bit more sunlight than what Brian typically does. So that, that probably accounts for that difference. But when we're talking about first crop bean planting, not replanting, we're to the point in the year where I would strongly encourage adding population to that, maybe about 5% a week from here on out. But the later we get, we've talked about it many, many times on this program, but we're trying to manipulate the number of flowering nodes we have, right? And so as we get delayed planting, we're going to reduce the plant height, the number of nodes that each individual plant puts on. We can overcome some of that by adding plants. So, but 80,000, and the caveat is that needs to be uniform, which never happens. I just don't have flat enough ground for that to happen, I guess. But if you can give me an 80,000 final stand that's completely uniform, I would not go back into that.
Very good.
To you, Carl.
Yep, I'll keep the pattern going and going thinner and thinner here. You did an excellent job summarizing that, Ben. Like first planting, we want to give it our best shake. We need to have enough to make up for our germination, deficit. Not you don't get 100% of your beans out of the bag up and out of the ground. You need to factor for those in-season stand losses. Brian in Northeast Indiana is subjected to more of that than I am on my coarser textured soils. Things like Phytophthora, and other in-season waterborne diseases. When it comes to a replant decision here, I'm always in favor of let's go ahead and plant into the existing stand. I don't subscribe to the theory of let's tear that stand up, especially facing this spring. You're looking at a moisture deficit for us up north, and so we need to conserve that soil moisture. And then it's just a matter of what do I stand to gain by thickening up a stand? If you have beans that were planted a month ahead of, this getting planted back into situation, are we going to drive plant height? Maybe. Our second planting of beans going to have pods on them? If not, what's the incentive here? And you can make a good case on coarser textured soils. It's weed suppression, and canopy heat reduction, because the more sunlight that gets in that isn't captured is a lost resource. And so you heat up the ground, you lose moisture, lack of moisture, more flower abortion. So I'd rather my friends be my foes in this situation and let the weeds be my own beans that I planted a second time, as opposed to it being water hemp. But I don't advise recreational replant. If you got a stand of 100,000, you're just fine, to Brian's point. And if you've got a somewhat consistent stand, if you're approaching 70,000 under ideal conditions, you can make a very, very handsome bean crop out of that. It's once you get down to 60 some that's where I've got the automatic, okay, we should probably do something about that here. But otherwise, that between 70 and 100, I feel pretty comfortable based on that uniformity of the stand itself. And when we say uniform, it's not like corn, where if you're looking at you skipped a plant or you skipped, a foot's worth, we can get by with that. You can lose almost 50% of a row. You can have about 50% of a row, I should say, with gaps in stand of a foot or two, and still have a lot of yield potential out there. It's just when you have big areas within fields that it makes sense to do something about. So wanted to get that on record as we're working through some crusting situations that we're hoping what will now have been yesterday's rain of May 20th comes through my area to soften up some crusts, and we're making kind of those what we hope to be final replant evaluations. And same for those with the wind damage, with the those aeolian sand deposits. You're looking at stands of 50,000 right now. That's a book it. So guys, great conversation looking at the storm damage from this last weekend and looking ahead to management decisions to round out the month of May. Brian Schrader, if folks want to follow along with what's taking place in Northeast Indiana, how might they get in contact with you?
Yep, when and if, usually on Instagram, B_K_Schrader, SHRADER. And how about you, Ben?
Yep, you can find me on X at the Ben Jacob, or on Facebook at Ben Jacob Agronomy. Carl?
And if you want to see some pictures of either satellite imagery of the sand as it was blowing across the plains, or what it did to some of our beans here locally, follow along on X at Joern, that's JOERN, and on Facebook at Joern Agronomy. With that, we'll wrap up another edition of the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy Podcast, and we're looking forward to seeing you down the road.
Thank you for listening to this episode from the Pioneer Agronomy team. Be sure to visit pioneer.com/podcasts to access additional episodes and learn more about our extensive on-farm data and innovative digital tools that are fueling forward-thinking farming.